Okay, that looks good.
You can see your screen. Yep.
Okay, and you can see screen one of the the title. Excellent. Yes, well, I was at the National Acoustic Laboratories, and you're absolutely right. I did have a lot to do with NAL NL1 and NAL NL2 and COSY and a bunch of other things. But one of the topics that I was involved in when I was at the National Acoustic Laboratories was auditory processing disorders in children. And after I left the National Acoustic Laboratories, that's what I focused on. So I won't be talking about hearing aids today. I'll be talking about difficulties that some children have in understanding the things that people are saying to them. Yes, is everything okay there? You look a little concerned, or is this clear?
Yeah, it's very clear. Yeah.
Okay, good, good. All right, so that's my topic, separating the causes of listening difficulties in children. And I'd like to acknowledge the people I've been working with most recently in this, Sharon Cameron, who got me into this field, Sriharsha Tikka and Mridula Sharma, who many of you might know, I think, obviously from India originally, are working on temporal processing issues with me. Zuhan and Alicia in the University of Manchester are collecting data on a whole bunch of new tests that I will be telling you about, and their supervisors in Manchester and Melbourne also. So I'll be talking about some controversies in this field, because it is a controversial field, then a way of describing the problem, then a model of speech understanding, which leads to a very structured set of tests for dealing with this problem. And I'll be talking about the tests that are available now and less so about tests that are coming later. So 4 controversies, which I think of as what not to focus on, because I think they're not really worthwhile. What should we call auditory processing disorders? First time it was called central auditory processing disorder in 1976, but the expert groups in America changed their mind 20 odd years later and called it auditory processing disorder, and then 5 years later called it, well, central auditory processing disorder in brackets. So a little indecision about whether it's central or not. But all the time that was happening, there were about a dozen other names that people used to describe individuals who had trouble hearing speech, especially when there's noise around, and yet had normal hearing thresholds or very close to normal. So these are all, as far as I'm concerned, all synonyms for auditory processing disorder. And I don't think it really matters what we call it, actually. A term that you'll see a lot lately is hidden hearing loss, which was originally used to mean the same as synaptopathy, cochlear synaptopathy, that is the inner hair cells not doing a good job of passing the signal on to the auditory nerve. But lately I see hidden hearing loss being used to mean any problem that causes listening difficulties. And so it's yet another synonym for auditory processing disorders. I'll just call it auditory processing disorders. Does it exist? Because some people, and particularly speech pathologists, dispute that it exists. Well, one of the ways they dispute it is by saying what it really is when children are not understanding, it's a form of a language disorder. Or others might say, no, it's a general developmental disorder. These children have a lot of things wrong with them. Or others might say it's a cognitive disorder, like an attention deficit. This is a picture of the auditory system, representation of all of the connections. It's an extraordinarily complex system from the cochlea through to various parts of the brain. And it's pretty much inconceivable that nothing could go wrong with this system. And if something does go wrong with it, what are we going to call it? Well, I think auditory processing disorder is a very reasonable term for a disorder in the auditory processing system. The sorts of studies that people will use to say, it's not real, is they'll note things like the amount of shared variance, so the commonality of cognitive abilities and auditory processing abilities. Or they might say children who've got poor auditory processing also tend to have poor language. And because of this commonality, they'll say, well, really, these are 2 words for the same thing. But cognitive abilities also share variance with language abilities, yet you don't find people saying these 2 things are the same. So I think we should not be put off by the fact that any one issue we look at, there is an increased probability that there is some other problem the child has. That doesn't mean the 2 problems are the same thing. All right. What sort of abilities does auditory processing encompass? Here's a quote from a book. Alice in Wonderland is the book. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. That's the situation we're in here. If you look at the American ASHA definition from 2005, they said CAPD is a deficit in neural processing that is not due to higher order language, cognitive or related factors. Just 5 years later, Dave Moore and colleagues said what's currently called APD for individuals without lesions should be redefined as primarily a cognitive disorder rather than a sensory disorder. So on the one hand, we're saying APD is not related to cognitive abilities. On the other hand, other people are saying APD is basically a cognitive disorder. These people are just using the same term to mean different things, and that's very confusing for everybody. I looked around the world at position statements. Sorry, I don't have one for India. And most countries, the professional organisations, have made the decision that they wish to consider APD as something, a problem that is not related to cognition or language. That is, it's independent of that or separate from it. The one that's different was the British statement where they said these two things are the same, and the Dutch position statement which said, well, we're not that convinced about APD. We think most listening difficulties are actually cognition and language. So why, last controversy, need APD be unimodal? That is, if a child's got something wrong, not just with their hearing ability, but also with their, say, vision, can we still call it APD? Well, I don't think it's actually a very useful question. Suppose we have a child who's got a deficit in auditory processing. What are we going to do? We're going to try and understand or identify what the deficit is. We're going to give training to improve the deficit for that child. And then, or we're going to improve the signal they get, like with a wireless remote microphone, to make it easier for them, clearer for them. What, on the other hand, if we had another child who had the same deficit in auditory processing, but also had a visual processing deficit, what would we do for that child? Well, I think we'd do the same things. We'd identify the auditory deficit, we'd give training, or we'd improve the input sound for them. And hopefully we'd also, or somebody would also tackle their visual problems. So I think the practical result of what we do actually doesn't depend, is not affected by whether the child has a problem in one modality or two modalities. So 4 controversies, hopefully dealt with, and I won't talk about them again after this slide. The name, well, I don't care, but I'm settling on APD. Does it exist? Well, of course it does, because things can go wrong in the auditory system. Do we include or exclude deficits in cognition? I think it's more helpful to exclude them because we can break the problem up into manageable bits that way. And are we limited to unimodal problems? No. If they've got other problems, deal with those problems as well. Right. How can we describe listening difficulties, which is a bigger term than APD, or better, what can cause listening difficulties? So one thing that can cause listening difficulties is a hearing loss. And by hearing loss, I don't just mean what you measure between 250 hertz and 8 kilohertz, and I'll come back to that later. So it might be a hearing loss that you can see in the audiogram, or it might not. It might be an auditory processing deficit. It might be a deficit in the ability to recognize speech sounds and doesn't affect processing of any other sounds. It might be a cognitive deficit, particularly attention or particularly memory, or it might be a language deficit, so that children cannot use their knowledge of language to fill in the gaps that are caused by noise and reverberation, such as in many classrooms. Any of these can cause a listening difficulty. A common recommendation because of that is to have a multidisciplinary evaluation, have a children seen by an audiologist, speech pathologist, a psychologist, and I don't think it's very practical. And it's also got the problem that each of those experts, each of those clinician experts is going to look at the child from their own perspective using their own tests, and they may not have sufficient commonality of language to actually come together. Even if they do, it's difficult, of course, to achieve that, to get 3 different experts to look at the child, come together and agree on what's the actual problem. One of the complications is that clinicians can really only deliver tests, and tests don't just measure one ability. Tests measure multiple abilities. So a listening difficulty can be caused by a deficit in auditory processing, also by a deficit in cognition, also by a deficit in language. So we say, why not just give a test of each of these? But if we design a test for APD where the children hear some sounds and then have to make a decision about those sounds, about which one is different, for instance, that test is relying on their cognition, particularly their memory. It's also relying on their auditory processing, and they've got to understand the instructions as a bare minimum. So it's going to depend on their language. So failure on any particular test can reflect problems in any one of these three domains. Let me give you an example of that. The dichotic digits test, very popular test, very nice test from one perspective, easy to administer, invented by Frank Music in 1983. It's in many batteries around the world. In the test, the child hears two digits, different digits, like 2 in one ear and 1 in the other ear. And then a second or two later, another pair, like 4 in this ear and 8 in this ear. And the child's task is to repeat back all 4 digits. We made a variation of this as an extra condition where, in fact, all 4 digits are in this ear and all 4 digits are in this ear. So the child can do this task just by listening to one ear alone. They don't have to do any dichotic processing, that is different signals in different ear processing. And when we looked at the correlation between the scores on the traditional dichotic free recall task and the scores on this new diotic condition, we had a correlation of 0.82. And that was across both children, representative children just sampled from a school, and children who were brought in to a clinic because they had something wrong with them. The same relationship applied. So it seems that the dichotic test is measuring something very similar to a test that's not dichotic at all. Therefore, it can't be just telling us about their dichotic ability, that is, their ability to hear a sound in one ear when there's a different sound in another ear. We also looked at the relationship between the dichotic score and their memory ability. And the memory was measured by how many numbers can the children remember, which translated into a Z score, which means how far above average or below average for children of that age are they. So any Z scores between -2 and +2, that's the normal range of abilities. And within that range, we see quite a strong correlation, 0.6, between the dichotic score and the memory score. So our interpretation of that is that memory is having quite a strong effect on what we measure in the dichotic test. And I imagine if a child actually had a strong memory deficit, the result would be even worse. I'll pass over that. It just means that lots of things other than dichotic ability is affecting scores on this dichotic test. And we didn't measure attention, but another study, Stavronos, actually found a high correlation between attention ability on this axis and dichotic ability up here. So another cognitive ability. In fact, dichotic testing was actually originally invented not to study hearing, but to study attention, the ability to selectively attend to one ear or another. Another test that's also affected by many abilities, the frequency pattern test, and this is the one that Sriharsha Tikka and Mridula and I are studying. In this test, the child hears 3 tones, so different pitches, and the child's task is to say in what order are the pitches, and that one was low, high, low, and that's a correct answer, as this spectrogram here shows. Easy to administer, easy to score, and also used by many people. But the result is affected by how good the child's pitch discrimination is, what their processing speed is, because these sounds come after each other quite quickly. How good's their memory? They have to remember the 3 and then play them back in their head, and then they have to attach labels to them. So there's 4 different abilities, any one of which can cause a poor score on this test. And this test is failed by many children brought in for a auditory processing disorder evaluation. Well, how can we go about finding specific deficits if any test then actually measures multiple things? Well, the first principle is we can use something called differential testing. This principle has been around for a long time. The speech in noise spin test from 1977 has sentences like, the sun was shining in the sky, and the person's job is to repeat back the last word in the sentence. At a different time, they'll also have the sentence, they were talking about the sky. Now, same word, Yet there's almost always a higher score for the first type of sentence than the second. Why? Because even though when there's noise around, and this is done in noise, then if the last word is somewhat masked by the noise, you can still work out pretty much what it is from the rest of the sentence. Whereas in this type of sentence, the second type, you cannot work it out. There is no information. So the difference between these two scores doesn't tell us about our ability to understand a word. It tells us about our ability to use context to infer what a word is that we haven't actually heard very well at all. So differential testing, in this case, to measure language ability. Second thing we can do is we can try our best to design tests that rely only on one ability and minimal effect of other abilities, but that's pretty hard. And the third one is that we can make statistical allowance for the other abilities that are affecting a score. Whenever we scale one of these tests, we always look at what is the age of the child. So we implicitly allow for age in saying, is this a normal result, above normal, below normal? Well, I'm saying we can actually do that, but not just allow for age. We can allow for memory. We can allow for attention in interpreting the results. Let me now show you a model of speech understanding. And this will lead into a structured battery that I'm talking about. So suppose we have an auditory signal, which might be speech or might not. First thing that happens after it's passed from the cochlea to actually it starts in the cochlea, and then as it progressively passes up the auditory system, various complicated analyses are done of that overall acoustic signal. They're listed here, the end result of which is some object formation. And that means that we turned a very complicated vibration on the eardrum into complex signals being analysed somewhere within the brain. If they're not speech, that might be the end of it. We just might recognise the sound, but it's not a speech sound. How well we can do this task depends on how much noise there is, how much reverberation, what's the rate of presentation, and I hope I'm not talking too fast at the moment, and also how strong are the spatial cues. If things are separated around us, then they're easier to perceive each one than if they're all jumbled together coming from the same place. If it's speech, the next stage is we need to compare the analysed signal coming in right now with our stored idea of what each speech sound sounds like. And then we identify the particular phonemes or syllables or even words, but we still don't have understanding. We just have bits of speech identified. How well we do that depends on how similar the sound coming in right now is compared to other words or sounds in our language. To get understanding, we need language processing. We need to take a whole message into account, like a whole sentence at a minimum, or maybe a phrase at a minimum. And then we can use our knowledge of syntax, our knowledge of semantics, our knowledge of the world to actually get to the understanding of what is the person who's talking intending. How well we do that depends on how strong are those other cues. Is there lots of context? Is there lots of good syntax, or is the person using really bad grammar? How long is the message? If it's longer, we've got more information to get context from, but if it's too long, then it starts to stretch our memory. If what we think we hear doesn't match anything that makes sense to us, of course, this is not a one-way progression through the brain. We have feedback to say, that sound that you thought was a for Matt actually might have been a k for cat, in which case we then change our idea of what was being said. All of this needs attention and memory for the process to work. What happens when we degrade the input, like just adding a bit more noise? Well, initially, nothing much happens. We still understand everything because these processes here enable closure, enable us to infer the correct words, the words that are actually said, despite not hearing them clearly. But eventually, with enough noise, things break down. And performance, or that is percent understanding, will go from complete understanding at a very high signal noise ratio down to no understanding at all at a very bad signal to noise ratio. And if that's what the curve looks like for, say, a typical 8-year-old, then a child who has a curve like that, what can we say? Well, it's the curve's lower down, or you can think of it as being out to the right. That is, this child needs a better signal noise ratio than the typical 8-year-old. In fact, we can say by how much they need a better signal noise ratio. Can we say what their problem is? Like, is it auditory processing? Is it a speech processing problem, a language problem, an attention problem, a memory problem? We do not know. If all we've done is measure their understanding, it could be any one of those things or several of them that's causing the problem. So we know how big the problem is, but we have no idea what caused it. So instead of saying, what disorder does this person have? What we should be asking is, how strong are the various deficits that they might have? How strong is the deficit in the area of hearing loss, auditory processing, speech sound recognition, language, and cognition? And preferably, we'd like to do this with a common unit of measurement, which is what we are working towards. So the way we're structuring this same picture into auditory tests is to start with what we call the top level test, which is the test of everything. So it's a test that if you've got a problem in auditory processing or speech processing or language or attention or memory, it will cause a poor score. So I'll be showing you a bit about this test. So top level test. The next one is a mid-level test. It doesn't involve language, but it does involve speech, and it does involve auditory processing. Now imagine what happened, and I'll show you about that test too. Imagine if we've got a child who's below average for age on this top level test, but when we give them the mid-level test, they're actually right on average. What would you conclude? Oh, they're not doing well when language is involved, but they're doing fine when all they're doing is recognizing speech sounds without language. That child has a problem in this area, in language, not an auditory processing problem, not a speech processing problem, but a language problem. And we can quantify that by the difference between these two scores. Will give us an idea of the extent of the language problem. Similarly, if we have a test just of auditory processing that doesn't involve speech, but does involve complex auditory processing like we use in speech, then we can do the same thing. We can look at the difference between these two scores, and that gives us a measure of their any deficit that they have in recognizing speech sounds that they don't have for non-speech sounds, in which case you would give them training in recognizing sounds of speech in difficult situations. So I'm just going to here list the various tests that we've got already developed and which are available now, and the tests which are active, very active research on. So in the memory area, we thought there was a need to improve memory testing to make it more accessible to audiologists and also standardize it and also to make it more accurate. And we've done that with something we've called DigiSpan. I'll show you a little about that. In the top level test, at the moment, you can use the Listen-S test, listening in spatialized noise sentences. And that's a pretty accurate test. We've made some improvements to it, and that's under development, called the Test of Listening Difficulties Universal. Told you, as in I told you there's a problem here. That's going to be a new top level test in about a year's time, but already you can use Listen-S. In the mid-level, we've got the listening in spatialized noise universal, which uses speech sounds made up of consonants and vowels that are in many languages. And we've also made an improvement to that, essentially adding reverberation to it, and that will be available within a year for sure. In low-level tests, we have the under development, within channel gap detection, between channel gap detection, and spectrotemporal resolution, which I'll show you in a moment. In language processing, we've made up a brand new test. It's called the test of closure, which currently are pencil and paper exercises where you show a sentence to somebody with a word blotted out, and their job is to try and guess what word it would be from the context. Well, we've made an auditory version of that. It's an auditory, it's a sentence that they hear, which has got one word not in there at all. It's taken out. In fact, there's a whistle put in its place, and the child has to say, what do they think the missing word is? That's a test of their ability to use language to fill in the gaps that are caused by noise and reverberation. And a couple of composite tests that don't really fit this structure, but are useful nonetheless. The Sound Scouts test. This is a take-home test that children can actually do at home on a phone or a tablet device, and it's testing their hearing and their auditory processing ability just with some input from the parents. I don't believe there is an Indian version yet, but there are versions in multiple languages now, and I suspect an Indian version may not be too far away. And if anyone's interested in working with us to develop one, we'd like to hear from them. And the dichotic digits difference test, which I've already talked about, doesn't quite fit that structure. It's kind of a mid-level test, but not quite. But it's a useful test nonetheless. So top level test, something that tests auditory processing, speech and language and memory and attention. Sentences like, listen to this sentence, you'll hear some competition and then a beep and then the target sentence. Ready? And I forgot to share the sound, to collect the sound when I did sharing. So excuse me one moment while I stop sharing and reshare with sound, because you didn't hear anything, did you? So this time, share screen and share sound with stereo high sound and share the right screen. Okay, you've got the screen back, hopefully. Give me a thumbs up there. The screen is back on the screen there. Yes, you can see the screen, can you?
Yeah, but we can't hear the sound.
I'll play the sound. I'll play the sound again now. Ready?
Oh yeah, we can. Sure.
The boy and girl swapped clothes as a funny joke.
Okay, so you got that. The boy and girl swapped clothes as a funny joke was the target sentence in the middle of the competition. The competition are children who are talking as if they're in different places around you in the classroom. And the audiologist's job, it doesn't match this sentence, of course, it's a different target sentence here, but the audiologist's job is to indicate which words, how many words are correct. And then the test adaptively changes the signal to noise ratio to find how much noise the child can tolerate while still getting 75% of the words correct. Okay, so that's going to be, that test is called Told You, Test of Listening Difficulties. It's also called Told and R. Sorry about that. The new name is going to be called Told You, despite what it says on the screen there. And we're currently collecting data on that in Manchester right now. A mid-level test, we now want a test that uses speech sounds, but doesn't involve language. How do we do that? Well, we use nonsense syllables. So if the target item will be things like goo bar, well, it means nothing in English, and probably in most languages it means nothing. And so these are combinations of consonants that are in almost every language in the world and 3 vowels that are also in almost every language in the world. And the child's task is just to repeat back the nonsense syllables that they hear. And again, it's an adaptive test that finds the signal noise ratio at which they can get 75% of the sounds correct. We have lots of normative data on this in Australia, and there is data being collected in several other countries at the moment to make sure that the syllables are good for other languages. Not surprisingly, children get better at it as they get older, up to teenage years. The test has 2 conditions, a spatially separated condition where the target sounds like they're straight in front and the other competing children sound like they're out to the side, and another condition where everybody sounds like they're right in front. And this then uses that differential principle that I told you about, because we can subtract these 2 scores to get the child's ability to use spatial information to help them understand the person they want to listen to, like the teacher in the classroom. And we know already from all the work we've done with Listen S that there are many children who had a lot of middle ear infections when they were young, who then developed a disorder in their ability to use spatial information. And the good news is that with auditory training of 15 minutes a day for 3 months, children can totally overcome that and get normal spatial ability back again. So we hope this is a test that can be used in other countries to diagnose that same condition in children. We have on the new version under development with reverberation as well. We have made it more precise, added reverberation, and we've got data from 3 different language groups. These are adults. Child data is just in progress at the moment, that their language background had really no effect on the scores obtained, whereas the acoustics of the condition had a huge effect on the scores. So this gap here, the difference between the signal to noise ratio at which they can just get 75% correct, is they need a very good signal noise ratio when everything is located together, but they can hear the signal way down in the noise when things are separated. If you've got normal spatial processing, that's what you can do. Low-level tests, we've got several. So one is spectrotemporal resolution. It's hearing a frequency difference, a frequency change in the middle of a complex sound. You're going to hear 3 sounds, and your job is to work out which of the 3 sounds is different from the other 2. Could you hear that? So the middle one had a falling sound, whereas the other ones had a rising sound. I'll play that again. And that's the spectrogram on the right of what you just heard. So there are 3 formants. 2 formants have no change in frequency, but the second formant has a falling frequency in this position 2, but rising in the other positions. So we adaptively then change how much the frequency changes, and we can measure the children's ability to do the same sort of processing they have to do to understand speech, but this is not a speech signal, so they don't need to know speech in particular. Gap detection, traditional gap detection is a burst of noise, a gap, and another burst of noise, and typically people can hear a gap when it's only 2, 3, 4, 5 milliseconds long. But that's not really what happens in speech. In speech, we do need to perceive gaps, but they're usually gaps between one frequency and another frequency at a later time. And these gaps, you need something like 50 milliseconds to be able to tell that the gap is there. So it's a more relevant task to speech perception. What about allowing for attention and memory? Well, I showed you this picture before. It was the dichotic scores versus memory ability. And typically what's done in tests is you say -2 standard deviations, that's the end of the normal range. So therefore all of these red diamonds, which are from children brought into the clinic, all of these are outside the normal range. They've all got a dichotic problem. But our interpretation is that dichotic ability depends, at least in part, on memory ability. So let's put the line down like this, so which takes account of their memory ability in saying what's abnormal. Now, all of these children who look like they are abnormal on the dichotic tests, we reinterpret that to say, actually, they've got pretty bad memory ability, and that made them do badly on the dichotic tests. It's only these ones who scored very badly on the dichotic tests, and we can't account for it from their memory. So we feel this is focusing attention on what their problem actually is, rather than what it looks to be based on the test result. That was a graphical representation of it. We'll actually do it with equations, but I won't labor on that. Well, what about memory? What type of memory? We could have short-term memory where people just have to repeat back what they just heard, or working memory where people have to do something with it before they repeat it back, and both are relevant. So we are using the very commonly used forward-digit span where children hear a sequence of numbers and they have to repeat back the number they just heard, or repeat them back in reverse order, and that's the working memory. We've improved the test by adding an adaptive section at the end, which doesn't make the test much longer, but it does make it quite a bit more accurate. And also the computer administration standardizes delivery, which should make it more accurate also. How do we allow for attention? That's trickier, because what sort of attention should it be? Sustained attention, divided attention, executive attention, switching attention? And should we measure it through auditory stimuli or visual stimuli? Well, what I worry about is when the attention was measured, if we measured it separately, how motivating was the attention task, and how motivated were they when they did the auditory processing test? And so our conclusion is it's better to try and estimate attention based on what the child did during the test itself. Now, we have experience of this from that Sound Scouts test that I told you about, the one where the children do it at home. There's 3 components: speech in quiet, speech in noise, and tone in noise. And they're all adaptive tests finding the signal noise ratio at which the child detect the targets. Here's an adaptive track in orange of a child. So this is trials across here and signal to noise ratio up here. So going down is better performance. This child looks like they were doing pretty well. They were getting down to around the gray, which is the average for children of this age. But then over time, it's gradually deteriorated, so their performance is getting worse and worse the longer they go. We'd interpret this as the child was basically losing attention as the test went on. And what we do is we then can take that fluctuation in attention into account in interpreting their score. And we've done this on a database of tens of thousands of tests of Sound Scout because it's been very widely used across Australia. And we do find this strong statistical relationship that the more fluctuating their adaptive tracks, the poorer their performance is. So I've talked about auditory processing deficits, speech sound deficits, cognitive deficits, language deficits. What about hearing loss? Just to finish up. There's an audiogram. Well, there's an audiogram, a blank audiogram, and we think of this as the normal hearing region. What about 10 to 20 dB? Do you think of that as normal? We did an experiment 10 years ago using the Listen-S test, and we found that speech and noise performance deteriorated as hearing loss went from 0 to 20 dB, excuse me, and was quite marked by 25 dB. So I don't think of this as normal, actually. I think of this as a slight hearing loss in that range there. What about in the extended high frequency region? Just recently, there was a paper by Mishra and colleagues who took two groups of children, one who had thresholds all the way out to 16 kilohertz on average, better than 10 dB, and one whose thresholds deteriorated in this high frequency, very high frequency range of 10, 12, and 16 kilohertz. And look at what happened when they measured their speech recognition ability in noise versus their age. The red regression line there relates to the crosses. That's not an ear, that's a group of children. And the blue relates to the blue circles. So those who had hearing loss visible only in this very mild and only in the extended high frequency range actually had worse performance in noise than those who had good hearing across the whole range. So we're now viewing a small loss in this very high frequency region as a marker that there is some deterioration in the cochlea, which might be one of the causes of the child having difficulty. And it could be cochlear synaptopathy, which I've mentioned already. We're aiming at a very efficient test structure such that you would give the top level test, and if everything's normal, stop, no more testing. And you can say, this child may have problems in the classroom, but it's not related to ability to understand speech in difficult situations. If it is abnormal, then we would go on and give the mid-level test. And if that's normal, the child could be referred off for a language assessment by speech pathologists. If it's also abnormal, then the problem is lying back, not in the language area, but back in the auditory processing or speech sound domain. So we then give the low-level tests or the spatial processing subtests of this mid-level test. And on the basis of that, we can either then decide to improve signal noise ratio with a wireless remote microphone, give deficit specific training if we can identify the specific deficit, including deficit specific training for spatial processing disorder, which already exists. And I've mentioned that, and it works. So to summarize, the tests that are available now, Listen-S, Listen-U, DDDT. So listening and spatialized noise sentences, spatialized noise with nonsense syllables, and dichotic digits with a diotic condition. And they're all available from Sound Scouts, at which you can go to the website there. And as a disclosure, I consult the Sound Scouts for a couple of hours every month. Under development is this big set here. Told you the improved version of Listen-U, spectrotemporal resolution, gap detection, temporal order perception, localization, digispan memory, and AudiClose, the closure test of language. The good news is that all of those with a red asterisk are language independent tests. So they'll work in any language. And the ones with the purple asterisk, they are tests which it's pretty simple to actually substitute different stimuli to make them also work in other languages. The top level test, because it absolutely involves language, and the AudiClose inevitably have to be developed in the language of that the children speak. The principles that I've been talking about are in this ear and hearing paper from 2 years ago now, Dillon and Cameron, separating the causes of listening difficulties in children. But of course, I've shown you some more recent things since this one was published. And I'd like to acknowledge the people funding this, Macquarie Uni and the University of Manchester Biomedical Research Centre, and PHONAC supported in the early years, and Sound Scouts supporting it now with financial contributions. So that's it from me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for enlightening on this. I was just wondering that anyway, Mridula is there in your team, and we had a chance to hear Mridula as well as Suzanne last time, and they were also talking on it. So the Indian versions can be guided by Mridula over there. Yeah.
Mridula is very involved. Yes, we work closely together. Our offices are only a few meters apart, so we have a lot to do with each other.
Yeah. And it was wonderful, I mean, to listen APD from you as well. We know that you work with quite a lot of pediatric cases when even the Australian hearing was there existing. So Australian hearing was working on the pediatric as well as on adults and geriatrics, whereas national hearing was more towards the adult and the geriatric. So yeah, so anyone have questions from the audience, please come over here on the dais to ask Professor Dillon. Please come on the dais if you have any questions, so Professor can see you as well.
When Australian Hearing, when we evaluated the children coming into the Australian Hearing Service over an 18-month period, there were over 600 children who were assessed, and 20% of those had that spatial processing disorder as a consequence of their middle ear infections when they were younger. So fortunately, we're able to offer treatment for those children.
Yeah. Any questions from here? Professor Suri, you have any questions? Professor Suri, you can come on the dais, please. Don't hesitate. Not an issue.
They're shy.
Yes, he is the only Indian author who written a book on audiology for the Indians. Otherwise, we used to always have that clinical audiology book, which is edited by Kurtz. So, yeah, so I am going to introduce you to one of the Indian author who has written a textbook in audiology.